Welcome to Raising the Bar, promoting strong feedback cultures in online and hybrid teaching environments edition, a 1-hour video conference featuring William Hart-Davidson, professor in the Department of Writing, Rhetoric, and American Culture, and Associate Dean of Graduate Education at Michigan State University, and Melissa Meeks, Director of Pedagogy for Eli Review, which we'll hear more about momentarily. I am Steve Dandino, Associate Provost at Colorado State University and Executive Director of the Reinvention Collaborative. And on behalf of our RC Research members, Research University members, I thank Drs. Hart-Davidson and Meeks for their participation, as well as Dr. Timothy Amidon, Assistant Professor, and his colleagues in the Department of English at Colorado State University for organizing and hosting this professional development opportunity. Dr. Amidon will serve as our moderator. Tim, the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you, and thank you all for coming, and thank you to Dr. Hart-Davidson and Dr. Meeks for joining us as well. I am particularly really delighted to have them join us because I've learned a lot about how to become a better professor and to think about how I might improve my own pedagogy through the work that they've done, and they've both spent a lot of time helping teach me and think about, help show me some different ways that I might approach various moves in my own teaching. So I'm really delighted for them to share some of their knowledge with y'all, and for this to kind of live on the Reinvention Collaborative space for those of others to view in the future. So without any further ado, I'll pass the ball on to Bill.
Thank you, everybody. We are going to talk to you today for about 25 minutes, and then we'll have some time for some Q&A, plenty of time, we hope. I'll share my screen here so that we can, you can see what I'm talking about. Title of our talk today is Promoting Strong Feedback Cultures in Online and Hybrid Teaching Environments. We have a third collaborator who couldn't be with us today. He is also an associate provost, and he is attending to some urgent business as we plan for what's going to happen in the fall. And I suspect many of the folks tuning in here will also be facing those same questions about what fall 2020 is going to look like. We have 5 strategies for success to share with you today, and we are eager to talk a little bit about each one. And we do invite you to think a little bit with us. And as always, these are things that we hope will inspire and act as heuristic devices in that they get you thinking more. We would love to hear your feedback, and we're always adjusting our points of view as well. So number 5 is plan engagement and feedback, not content delivery. And this is, we begin here because we think that in the shift to sudden online teaching that many of our institutions had to make in the spring due to COVID-19, you got to see something that those of us who've spent a lot of time thinking about online teaching and learning have known, but in a rapid shift, it comes really to the fore. And that is that it is the thing that gets lost most readily in such a rapid shift to online learning is not your access or students' access to content. It is all of the little bits of interaction, peer interaction, interaction between teachers and students. That's where the disruption happens. All of those informal and in some cases formal sources of feedback that students need to understand if the learning is going well can be disrupted in an instant. And so when we talk about planning for success in online teaching and learning, it is natural in some ways for us to go back to our old habits as instructors and think about content. But as Jeff reminds us here, and we beat this drum all the time, he says, we have to think about engagement and feedback as the thing to preserve. That's the element of the learning environment that is most likely to be lost in a sudden shift to online teaching and learning. And so when we talk about making engaging learning spaces online, that's really what we're talking about. I wrote a piece that I will have links to that I invite you to take a look at after this, and feel free to share it. It's on a Medium post, and it was later reposted on my college's site. And we were trying to think through in that piece what we're calling a resilient pedagogy. And the key element of a resilient pedagogy is that you think as carefully about all of the interactions that enable learning as you do all of the content that you have to cover in a semester. The image here is evocative. I teach and am an administrator in a College of Arts and Letters. And so the kind of learning spaces we're really thinking about how to do and how to preserve coming into the fall are things like our pottery studio, our ceramic studio. I had a meeting with them yesterday, and the subject of the meeting was, what are all the ways that the studio space itself enables learning? And it isn't anything about the physical space necessarily. It's about how people are able to communicate in that space. Sometimes not with words, right? Sometimes just by changing angles. Sometimes I need to move over and see how they're using the tongs. And I can change perspective in a 3D space, and with lots of bandwidth, live experience like the class has, I can move around. So those things, as you might imagine, are much more fragile in a space like the one that we're in now. So if I said, come around to the other side, you can see what's over here, it's not possible. So a resilient pedagogy imagines that and tries to preserve those elements of learner agency and interaction that make learning spaces especially rich. I'm going to invite Melissa now, my colleague, to talk a little bit about if you decide, so let's imagine that you're on board with this, then what? So Melissa, do you want to talk for a minute?
So once you've decided to make learning experiences a big deal in your course, it's going to shift your perspective on time. And this workload estimator, developed by Betsy Barr, Alan Brown, and Justin Esseret, and posted now at Wake Forest University, gives you a way to know how much of a burden these novel activities are going to be. So you want to make sure, as you're designing really cool things, that you also recognize that cool things take time. And that's one element of following this principle in an inclusive way.
Yeah, the interesting thing that's easy to take for granted, and in fact is a wonderful thing about face-to-face learning environments, is our ability to rapidly shift focus and to be improvisational. That is a function of those being high bandwidth, low latency environments. I know that seems pretty technical, but what all that means is a lot of channels of communication can exist simultaneously. But when we compress all of that down in online learning, and we pump it over increasingly small wires and fibers, we lose that because it's a much lower bandwidth, high latency environment. And so that means that we need more time to estimate how these things are going to shift and how it's all going to fit together and work. All right. So I went right past it, didn't I? So we're going to try to end each of our topics here with a takeaway. And the takeaway for number 5 is what I like to try to understand at the end of every face-to-face classroom. It's the same question I would ask in an online classroom. Who feels heard? Who was included? Do I know who was included? If you ask yourself that question, it's a really, I think it clarifies a lot of things. If you're teaching an online class, you should have the same ability to know who you reached that day and who you didn't. All right, are we ready to move on? Number 4, we're going to try to keep you up to date about where we are. This next one is getting into the area that Melissa and I have done a lot of work on, and we have made a publication that's forthcoming, available to you if you would like a copy of it, where we present it with some data and evidence. We're happy to share. But it's about the idea of setting up our classrooms to enable students to practice. Okay, so what do we mean by that? And we want you to construe that quite broadly, because we think that it applies in lots of curricular spaces. It applies in if you're practicing cello, it applies if you're practicing algebra, and it applies if, like Tim and Melissa and I, you're practicing writing. One of the things that we try to do is give students enough space inside a curriculum, inside a course, inside a project, and inside a particular class session to practice what they need to learn. That can be a little bit to do in this situation where we have limited engagement. And so the benefits of practice spaces can get lost as we emphasize the more stress test components, the summative evaluation components. So we have a picture for this that we like to show people. Practice, not a stress test. Here's what we want to ask you. How much practice do students have to have at the thing that you're trying to help them learn for you to reasonably suspect that they've learned something? So the example here is a set of stairs. Let's imagine that you were trying to get healthier, or maybe lose some of those winter pounds like I'm trying to do right now. How many times would you have to climb those steps before you stood on the scale? When would you even think to do that? Is it one step? Would you do one step and then step on the scale and expect to be better? No, right? But if you look at the way we design online courses in teaching and learning sometimes, that's kind of what we do. We will put a lot of effort into the moments when we are getting students to step on the scale, and not enough time in between to see if they actually climb the steps. More importantly, we don't signal all the time, what is the routine that's going to get you to 2 pounds less? How many times up and down these stairs is going to do that? And over what period of time, right? So in writing, we have this graphic, and this comes from something that we like to talk about as assigning writing in small bits rather than big chunks. So if you look at the top common timeline for writing projects, and you imagine that that's a paper in somebody's class, it often looks like this, where the vast majority of the time segments, and you can think about those as days or class sessions, maybe over a 2 or 3 week period, is devoted to drafting. And then there are a couple of little moments at the end here for review and revision. What we have come to understand, both as a field and then with increasing clarity in our own work as researchers, is that the bottom timeline is a better practice routine. And the reason why is that there's more feedback in it. Students can learn a little bit better when they're off track, and we can course correct earlier. There are also a few other simple facts about it. More repetitions, right? More focus. And by that I mean, because they're writing a smaller bit, they can focus on the 1 or 2 things we really want them to learn and get those down before they move on to something else. If you imagine this as a cello spot, one of Bach's cello suites, we might break it down into 8-bar measures instead of trying to play the whole thing down the first time. And that's what we're talking about. Same way with dance class. Dance class is one of my favorite analogies, because your dance teacher always goes slow, helps you break it down the steps into 8-bar measures, and then you build on those. And then just when you think you're good, she goes, great, do it 3 more times. We think that most classes should be like that. Algebra class should be like that. Okay, you factored a polynomial once. It's not time for the test. It's time to practice it 4 more times. Right? Then it's time for the recital. Then you invite the parents in with the camcorders, but not before. So here's the takeaway for number 4. When you look at your schedule, have you created an exercise routine, a practice routine that would reasonably produce improvement? And not just for the best student, but for the struggling student? Are you sending them up and down the stairs enough times? Are you breaking down the concerto into 8-bar measures or 8-bar segments? Are you giving them the feedback that they need in between those segments? All right. We're moving right along. This is the heart of our presentation. We're going to probably spend the most time on this one because this is our bread and butter at Eli Review. So Eli Review is a software service that supports peer learning. Students can share their work. Teachers can create review criteria that let peers respond to one another. And those responses and the act of responding to one another is the key learning moment. It isn't only the drafting that they did to get there, but it's the ability to do criterion reference review and to put in words for someone else what it takes to improve. Those acts of making explicit what the learning goals are actually help the giver learn something. And we have a word for that. We'll talk about that in just a little bit. Almost all teachers know this, starting from kindergarten and elementary school. We have this really powerful pedagogical pattern called think, pair, share. So you give someone a chance to think about something, and then you put them in small groups to share it with one another in a peer situation, and then you have them open up and share it with the large group. When they do that, they have the power to draw on one of the most powerful resources in a classroom, and that is each other. Leveraging peers is the most powerful thing we can do. And in online spaces, it's one of the things that's at risk of being lost. And so that's why we want to focus on it here. So remember that dance studio I talked about. Let me see if I can move that up here. There's probably no better analogy than the dance studio for understanding how peer learning works. I don't know about all of you, but I'm not a very adept dancer. I'm not exactly light on my feet. So if I'm in a situation where I have to learn a few dance steps, I'm stealing looks at the most skilled person in the room every minute. And I'm going, where is my foot supposed to be? And I am not asking the teacher because I would be petrified that then they'll make me do it in front of the whole class. So I'm watching, Mikey over here, Mike's team, and I'm learning everything I can from what Lev Vygotsky teaches us to call the most capable peer. And this is a concept in collaborative learning called peer scaffolding, right? If Tim knows how to do something and I'm in the room with Tim, I'm watching Tim. Tim is a learning resource for me. And that's great. And in 1 minute, the first 8 bars, Tim might be the most skilled peer. The next 8 bars, he was asleep at the wheel. I might be a resource for him. When that happens, we have another word for that comes from Vygotsky, and that's zone of proximal development. You might have heard of that, the ZPD. So when you're amidst a lot of capable peers, you can create a powerful learning space called the zone of proximal development, where all the learners are more capable than they would otherwise be if they were working alone. Now, in a studio like this, you can see what the affordances are. clear line of sight, ability to access the knowledge of other peers freely and without a lot of effort when it's needed. Now think about your online learning space. Think about your LMS. Can students do that? Can I sneak a peek? Not in a cheaty way, but in a helpful peer scaffolding way? Very hard. Not unless we go out of our way to make it happen. Melissa?
So Kathy Davidson posted this blog, which I encourage you to read in its entirety. And she's encouraging instructors to design for fall with an awareness that students' lives are very stressful. But in it, she offers this tidbit of wisdom. She reminds us that humans are terrible volunteers, right? And that they learn best from the think, pair, share that Bill just described. So we work with Eli Review, a peer learning technology, as Bill said, and that means we have a hammer, and so everything is a nail. And in that way, what Kathy Davidson is really telling you is that you need to require low stakes write, review, revise cycle on a routine practice schedule. For real, that's what she said. I'm sticking to that. But it's also about understanding that the kinds of peer review that support community are not fault-finding missions. Instead, we need to work on giving students some examples for building community through their interactions with each other's drafts. So I'm going to try to steal the screen from Bill for just a second.
Yeah, sorry about that.
This is going to take just 1 minute. Are we back to sharing?
Yep.
Great.
You got it.
So this is a strategy that was used at University at Buffalo in Eli Review that borrows this 3CQ method by Jennifer Stewart Mitchell. This is one thing to hold into your brain. We're going to come back to it and use it. But that method gives students two requirements. They can offer a compliment, a comment, a connection, or a question. They pick two of the four, and that structures the way they interact with each other. So this isn't fault finding. This is building off what someone else said in the same way that might happen in a face-to-face conversation. I have a couple more examples that we'll come back to in the Q&A, but I want to hit two that reinforce this idea of peer learning as building intellectual community. The first is from Dr. Christina Venegas at UC Santa Barbara in film studies. And she finished a peer review with this question: what did you learn from this paragraph about analyzing style? Hardly directive for students, but Christina has said she reads this feedback first every week because it's fascinating the ways that students will support each other. They'll offer new ideas, they'll offer a resource, they'll observe something about writing. And so this moment, this final comment of what did you learn from this paragraph, helps students see that their role in giving feedback is supportive, not critique. One more quick example. This is muddiest point writing. You might know that. It is from Mosteller 1998, and it's usually used in lecture classes where students would, in the old days, write on an index card, what is the point from the lecture that they didn't understand. You can do that same kind of thing as a peer learning exercise, and it would look sort of like this. A quick rating scale for students to say, I have this question too, or I totally know it. Right? And that lets students vote up the thing they need help on, but it also lets them be a peer resource for their colleagues. And that helps them feel like, hey, I got this. I'm not the only one who's confused, and I have something to offer. So these kinds of ways of thinking about peer review move beyond fault finding towards something we call, or Bill calls, giver's gain.
Yeah, so giver's gain is our little alliterative shorthand for the learning benefits that come from engaging in the process of giving feedback. And Melissa has turned it into a full-on Dr. Seuss poem. And so we love to say, what you read, you can imitate. Right? This is a classic rhetorical learning strategy of imitatio. What you detect, what you see in someone else's work, you can correct in your own. One of the powerful things that we get out of peer learning is the ability for students to go, oh, that's what I need to do. And they get it by telling someone else to do it. What you explain, what you can make explicit to someone else, you can retain. So what you might have known intuitively, but when you're forced to talk it through, you suddenly have in a more explicit way for yourself as a strategy. And of course, what you suggest, you too can try. And Tim can verify this, but one of the powerful things about Eli is that after a student does a review, they get all the feedback from their peers, and we ask them to make a revision plan with that feedback. Then the teacher can also make some suggestions to add to the revision plan. The most common suggestion we make as teachers is take your own advice. It's not on your plan. It's the advice you gave. And they go, oh yeah, right? Because often they're pointing to things that they didn't see in their first draft, but now they can make explicit. So this is giver's gain. This is the dynamic of peer learning. If you have been a reviewer, and all of us as academics have, you know that it's the single best way to get better at writing. In my dean's office job, I do graduate education and research, and I coach people, among other things, on how to be more successful at grant writing. And my first bit of advice is get on a panel for reviewing grants. You'll be much better grant writer after you review them than the first time. All right, ready to move? So your takeaway here is enough giver's gain happening? Am I using the feedback opportunity as a learning moment? We often, the main problem that we see in that, the timeline that we gave you with too little time for feedback, is that the most powerful moments for these realizations, these reflective moments of oh, yeah, I could do that, are pinched to the end. And so we want to actually make more of those opportunities rather than less. This is pretty close, by the way, to what other people think of as active learning. I think that when people are talking about active learning, this is really the mechanism that they want more of. We just try to make it a little bit more explicit. Active learning is when students engage in reflective feedback with one another.
Bill mentioned that timing is one of the issues with getting giver's gain, but the other one is making the group too small. So plenty of instructors put a small group together because they want the workload to be bearable. But you need the group to be large enough so that there is a zone of proximal development, and also so that you get enough practice rounds to have good feedback at all. So the big thing about giver's gain is to understand that the work of review is the work. Don't shortcut that work just to save time or to reduce student burden. That's the burden you want them to carry.
Yeah, this is really hard. I'll pick on our own discipline here. This is really hard for writing teachers because we think of ourselves as the source of feedback. And we think if we're not giving it all, we're not doing our job. The problem with that is we end up learning the most because the feedback giver is the one who learns all that stuff. So that leads to number 2. As a teacher, I'll be sweet. I'm the sweet one, as Melissa says. Melissa got to write this one: be present and know when to shut up. I would say restraint is your friend as an instructor. When feedback is a mechanism for learning, don't dominate the conversation. It's the same way that we think about not dominating it from the point of view of a lecture. If giving feedback and using criteria to talk through how a draft meets or doesn't meet those criteria is the place where lots of learning is going to happen, don't hog it all. Be present, make sure that everyone is engaged, maybe pay attention to reciprocity if everybody is giving what they're getting, and be a coach, helping them get closer to the criteria rather than further away. But don't do the work for them.
And we're using an image here that might be weird, but it recalls Archimedes' idea about levers. Give a long enough one and a place to stand and he could move the world, right? And so we use that to help people understand that there's a difference between the long lever of group peer feedback and the short lever of individual feedback, right? So when you're one instructor replying to each student, you're using a short lever. Takes a lot of energy to move the world with a short lever.
Which is fine. I love that about teaching, that I get to be the one who learns a ton, but I try to keep that in mind. And we have one more. So we're going to end with one of our classics. This is another feedback pattern that we teach, and there's a video about it. Here's me horrifically with my big mug on the internet. And this is, we call this the describe, evaluate, suggest pattern. It forms something of a virtuous cycle. And what it really is a heuristic for helping people give helpful comments. It doesn't only apply in writing, it can apply in all areas of your life. But it goes like this: you describe. That's the first step, and that's really key, because often we will jump right to step 2, which is suggest. Or the evaluate, the evaluate step. Describing does something that most learners really need, which is to say, reality check, did I do the thing I thought I did or not? Are you seeing what I'm seeing? And then, with reference to the criteria that are involved, you can make an evaluative statement. And the third move is a suggestion. And that is a way, coming off of the description and the evaluation, to either make a change to get closer to the criteria, or to do that same successful move again in another place. So that pattern, describe, evaluate, suggest, is super powerful, and it can fit in about 2 or 3 sentences most of the time in just about any situation that calls for comments or feedback.
And we use this table to help everyone understand that describe, evaluate, suggest, in writing teacher terms, functions as a genre. It does some work for the reviewers, it does some work for writers. So as a reviewer, when you are doing the describe move, you're actually slowing down your own reading process. And that is critical for online reading, where we all skim and skip, right? So for a reviewer, being forced to describe first will guide the way they pace themselves through the piece. And then the evaluation stage is where they pull the criteria that the instructor has identified as important. And without that focus, they're not paying attention to the things that are going to lead to improvement for the draft they're giving feedback to or in their own draft. And then in the suggestion phase, this is where you really benefit from a cheap mistake. So for sure, you've made a mistake in writing and you felt that it was very costly. But when you notice someone else's mistake in writing, that's much cheaper for you, right? But you are taking into your toolkit this idea. So we're building a repertoire for solving writing problems with a little bit less of the pain of committing that mistake yourself. So for reviewers, describe, evaluate, suggest functions to help them do a good job. But on the flip side, it also benefits writers. When you open a comment that, as Bill said, makes you feel heard, right? And then you can know that reviewer has built some ethos or built some credibility, that they've paid attention to what you're up to in your own writing before they start to point you towards criteria where you might have missed the mark. And that this part about students getting feedback that disagrees with each other is a really important teachable moment in peer learning. One reviewer is going to love it and one reviewer is going to hate it. That's just life. That doesn't mean somebody did something wrong, but it's very hard for students to understand that. So the describe moment helps them kind of figure out who they're going to trust and why, instead of immediately dismissing things they disagree with. And that suggestion stage gives them the reviewer's idea about what they do next, but it also gives them some agency about how to follow that. So we call this the virtuous cycle of helpful feedback, because if everybody, reviewers and writers, are following describe, evaluate, suggest, helpful feedback is resulting.
Yeah, if everybody did describe, evaluate, suggest, we wouldn't have reviewer 2. We would have all reviewer 1s. And so here is the counterintuitive question maybe that we'd like to leave you with as an overall indicator of whether or not your class is going well. And that is one of your learning goals, ask, are students getting better at giving feedback? Are they helping me help themselves to become better learners? Because that is often your most powerful indicator that they can make progress on their own. So here are our 5, and we're going to give you a chance now. We're going to pull back that 3CQ thing, and we're going to ask you for some feedback. Pick 2, and as Steve mentioned at the top, we don't have to stick to the chat because we can talk. We have a small group with us today. But if you're watching and you'd like to send us some feedback, feel free to do that. You can look us up on our social accounts or send us an email. But we invite you to pick 2 of these and give it a try.
As someone familiar with the heuristic and as the host, I'll kind of jump in and say, I really like the describe, evaluate, suggest framework, and I think it's something that I've seen students really do well with. What are some strategies for really helping like students to get really good at that? Right. So there's the heuristic itself, but are there activities that you've seen people utilize that are different ways of approaching how to teach that?
I didn't get much of that. Did any of you?
So I'll try. Tim said he likes describe, evaluate, suggest, but he wants some activities that kind of go beyond just that instructional moment of these are the parts. Is that fair enough, Tim? As a summary, just nod your head or thumbs up. Yeah, okay. You know, it was gobbledygook. So I'll tell you some of the things that I've seen people do to go beyond what I call preventative measures, right? So preventative measures are things that you tell students from the front of the room before they do a thing. Those have very little impact on what students do because habit is stronger than caution, right? You know this as a parent very clearly, right? And so the things that have the most impact are things that interrupt activity after it's happened. So modeling a comment during a review or after a review to say, this was an excellent comment. Let's see how this person accomplished these moves, because student language is really different from teacher language. I'm much more aware of that today than I ever was as a teacher in a classroom, right? I can no longer produce something that sound like my students sound, and that makes me feel old. But it also helps me tune in to the way students are talking to each other. And the other thing that that has really worked well is to take an accurate comment that was not formulated as describe, evaluate, suggest, and rewrite it in front of the class. So just rewrite it together so that they see that there's revision around comments, just like there was revision around drafts. And often what you're trying to do is just build students' vocabulary for talking to each other about writing. We like to call this meta discourse, right? But it's easy to forget that students need help with just those little hedges. As a reader, I noticed that. Or you might consider blah, 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 right? And so showing students how to take a comment that was right, but said in a way that didn't facilitate the writer to use that comment can be really powerful.
Yeah, and I saw the second part of your question there, Tim. What are some other ones? I have a really timely example because this morning I was on with two colleagues here at Michigan State from our extension, MSU Extension. I know that at Colorado State they have is also a land grant institution, and we are doing something this summer. It's very exciting, called Humanities and working with a network of libraries and museums across the state to offer arts and humanities programs through our extension arm of the university. One of the classes that is getting taught is in songwriting. So I was on with three of my colleagues, two from the School of Music, and we were adapting the describe, evaluate, suggest heuristic for the songwriting example. And we were talking a little bit about how they could use it to help each other, help the students give themselves feedback, give each other feedback on the songs. They're actually making beats. So this is another thing that Melissa made me feel super old. They're using some software to make beats. I'm like, I don't know what it means to make a beat, but I think if you play me a few, I think we could do this. And so we were practicing using describe, evaluate, suggest to talk about that. It was really cool.
That's awesome.
Louann, do you have a question?
Yeah, I do.
Anybody else?
Thank you so much. This has been just really interesting. And I listen from the point of view of the department chair in professional development and a background in English education and teacher preparation. So so I like it for all those. Anything that mentions Vygotsky just is fine with me. and I like the work that you and Melissa are doing. I'm thinking describe, evaluate, suggest seems to connect also with teacher professional development and observations and so on. And so my question, my wondering is really about teachers learning to give feedback and what it would take. What do you think? How much and what kind of practice do faculty need to reach the top of those stairs more than once? And so that's a curiosity that I hope is related enough that you don't think it's just irrelevant.
No, not at all. I think that one of the interesting things about all of this for us is that it rarely occurs to writing teachers, well, it's the area that we know the best, to budget time in their semester to teach students to give good feedback, right? They're teaching them to write the other things in the class. Once they do, they see the payoff, but it's quite possible that almost every student has gone through most of their content area courses never having had a chance to work on giving feedback to each other. And it's not clear where that fits in any curriculum. So I think it is super useful just to break down the moves of it and spend some time, even if it's just one day, of here's how we're going to do this. And the way I tend to do it is I usually make it a part of the class. And where I've seen this actually practiced more explicitly is in my colleagues in art, in studio art, because critiques are such an important part of the studio art tradition that the first couple days are usually all about how to talk to each other about your art. And so it is all meta discourse, and it's about the habits and practices around performing a studio, being a studio. So I try to take some time, and this is what that resilience piece is all about, to make all of my classes into a studio.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll say, this is a learning studio, even though today we're learning about research methods. We're not learning about throwing pots. And here's how our studio is going to work. And so that's how I usually frame it. And then the other opportunities can really come from, I think, the substance of what you're trying to learn. So it becomes a really natural thing, for example, to have the group develop a rubric together. Mm-hmm. Because then the criteria are shared so that the first review comes and they go, oh yeah, this is what we said we valued.
And Louann, I'll answer your question a different way. Bill and I hear things differently. So I'll just say what I heard you say first, and then maybe this will be productive. I heard you ask, how do you train teachers to do this work? Was that kind of where you were going?
That's part of it. Yeah.
So when I'm working with faculty on making peer learning work, I make a distinction between less bad peer review, right, mm-hmm. and helpful peer review, right? And so if you just want to make peer review better, there are a set of strategies that you can do pretty quickly. If you want helpful peer feedback, then you need 5 rounds of practice. Your mm-hmm. first exposure is going to go poorly no matter what you say before it, because you can't overcome the habits and baggage students bring. They just won't believe you. So you want to get the first one done, and this works with teachers and it works with students. It's just a condition of learning, right? Mm-hmm. So the first one is a waste. It's a miss. And so you want to intervene heavily and strong after the first one. And you want to assign the second review pretty close to that first one so that people don't forget the pain of getting it wrong, right? So you need 2 really spaced closely together. And in that second review, what we see is about 60% of the group, teachers or students, will do describe, evaluate, suggest at least once in a comment. Right? That's because it's the learning cycle. So you have a heavy-handed intervention to teach, describe, evaluate, suggest, model, correct, all those kinds of things. Some side conversations with people who are just not pulling their weight, right? All those kind of things need to happen after that second review. By the third review, in most classes that I've seen, everybody who's going to become a helpful reviewer is on the path. If they haven't committed to the process with buy-in at that point, then you've got larger problems that probably require a resource beyond your class, right? So you'll get to whole class consistency or whole learner consistency after 3 rounds of practice. But that just gets you to the first stair, right? So if you want the whole level of feedback to go up, then you're going to have to get to 4 and 5. So I think about 4 as, and the who's the guy that did forming, storming, norming, performing, that guy, whatever that guy's name is, about group dynamics. This is that thing. By the 4th review, it's good. By the 5th review, that's when you can go, oh, okay, we're locked in.
Mm-hmm. I like that you gave me complimentary responses, because yours gives me gives all of us hearing the seminar a way to proceed, and with clear steps. And Bill's way to proceed makes me think about, if we change our metaphor, we change the actions that follow from that. So thinking of a classroom as a studio suggests that work is done differently than people might expect. And if we get people in that metaphorical frame, things change.
Yeah, I really lean hard. I really lean into the metaphors in that way. In the resilient pedagogy piece, I talk about, for example, the elements that are in a studio that we want in all learning spaces. And so the 2 to me that are most important are handrails and mirrors. So that is, we want to help everyone get into the positions they need to get in and be as inclusive as we can. And we also want to encourage reflection.
Yeah.
Those are the most powerful things for learning.
Thank you both.
Toby has a question in the chats, and she writes, Melissa, how does that work in an online class where students are used to working in a 2 or 3 day a week space in F2F? Are the multiple reviews in rapid succession, or kind of a pacing question?
I've seen people do very different things. The pattern that has worked the best is to assign a moment of the process to a day of the week. So Monday, every Monday, a little bit of writing is due, a tiny bit. It might be a topic sentence and 3 pieces of evidence, only one of which can be a quote, right? That's a little tiny piece of writing. And then the review starts Tuesday morning and it's due Wednesday night. And that is your peer feedback with as big a groups as you can stand so that students have that learning resource. And then Thursday is the reflection, the revision plan moment in Eli Review. And so the campuses that have had the most success with raising the middle of the quality of feedback throughout the class have sort of established Mondays writing, Wednesday peer review due, revision plans due Thursday. And what the curriculum design question is what's the small bit on Monday, and how does it link to next Monday, and how does it link to the next Monday?
Thank you. I understand that. I guess one of the things I'm thinking about is how we help students who are most accustomed to a traditional face-to-face instructional model understand how moving online isn't more work, because that's part of the feedback that we heard from students in our crazy pandemic version of things this spring, is that they felt they were being asked to do a lot more work. They probably were being asked in many classes to do more writing, because a lot of teachers, I think by default, just turned everything into a discussion, which was probably, we're learning about how to do things better. But I see in the class I'm teaching right now, there is an expectation that, we're on a summer schedule, and so we are supposed to be working 5 days a week. But for students who are used to thinking, my writing class takes place on Tuesday and Thursday, how do we help them adapt to a model of, smaller bits each day, which I can see is better for learning, without feeling like they're being asked to do a lot more work, particularly if they're taking 5 or 6 classes that might all be asking them to do bits each day.
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think one of the things there is true of that pacing timeline that we showed earlier. So in that 2-week chunk that usually we give students to draft, they don't use that whole 2 weeks. They use the last day. and so the first intervention is getting them to be honest about, let's break this down into hours and minutes. And let's actually talk about, how long are you going to spend drafting? How long are you going to spend reviewing? And how long are you going to spend putting together a revision plan? And let's put those on the calendar in reasonable intervals. So we often talk about this, and in our article that we'll make available, we call this feedback fitness, because we have a lot of analogies with a fitness or workout schedule. And that includes intervals where you have work and then you have recovery or rest. You need both, but if you're cramming all the work into one little space, it's not ever going to be as effective. So I think that's one of the interventions. And you're right that in a situation where now everything moves online, the pressure to get that distribution right is much more. I see it in my own kid who is in high school, who left to her own devices will leave everything to the last minute. But if she's got to do all the things online now, that is much more high risk, because she can't just roll into class and fake it like she's used to doing. She's got to come prepared. So that's one of the things. Melissa?
I also think like some of it is helping students understand that in a face-to-face experience, fluency is happening, not mastery. So fluency is, oversimplified, I understand the words that are coming out of your mouth. Mastery, oversimplified, is I can do it myself, right? And so what a face-to-face experience does is it overestimates what you can do because you're relying on fluency cues and you have very little mastery expectation. So there's a psychological term for that too, the Dunning effect, the Kruger-Dunning effect, right? Where you hyperinflate what you know because you're too stupid to know what you don't know, right? And so students are in the online environment, right? What they're missing is a fluency cue, because mastery is first. It's the first step. Write it yourself. Then you get peer feedback. So that's where this turn to building intellectual community through peer learning can help with that, right? So that they see each other doing well. And I heard what you said, right? And you're trying to build back some of those things that were lost in that fluency environment. But having an explicit conversation with students about how it feels to have to show mastery before you have a fluency indicator. You wouldn't use that terminology, but you know where I'm driving, right? That's an important piece to helping students make the adjustment to online.
Yeah, let me add just one more point there, Toby. I think that in this fitness metaphor, the key shift we have been encouraging people to do is to reduce volume, but keep intensity about the same. So intensity in a review situation is represented by attention to the criteria and getting people to adhere to specific criteria when they make comments, but it's not asking them to do 300 more or an hour or 2 hours more of it. And so you can substitute in these situations some intensity for volume.
Yeah, I love that metaphor in particular. I think a lot about like training and how I've learned like it isn't all about just going and doing gross miles. Like sometimes you need to have a harder effort to get better or to improve too, or a more intense effort in a certain kind of a way. So I think about that like as a bike rider. One of the questions I have is like more about like the global like course design implications of moving to this kind of a pedagogy. And since I've taught with Eli a bit, I think a lot about this in terms of like how students kind of come to the class with perception and how colleagues in writing studies tend to have certain views of like how we have traditionally approached like curriculum design, right? And so one of the things I think I heard you just kind of mention, Bill, was that move towards thinking about volume and reducing volume in order to like get to the intensity part or to blend some of that. And so, that's one of the things, like, what are some of the strategies that you found faculty that are using this utilize that have been most successful for kind of moving away from like a 4 or a 5 assignment framework, or to fit this framework within a framework so that it isn't simply about the volume and content, but more towards that kind of intensity practice-based model?
Yeah, I'll point to 2. So one, I'll go back from sports to music again, is a typical writing class in some cases will have students writing 5 very different papers in a semester. That's like asking, a student to learn 5 concertos instead of working on getting one really good for the recital. And so I think it can be often about finding what are the specific learning goals within a genre or an assignment, and asking them to spend more time and repetition on those than simply adding another assignment. So that's one. The other is a kind of a new thing that the teacher does, and it's a parallel to the point that you just asked. So if students are giving more of the feedback and we're doing fewer assignments, what am I supposed to do with my class time? And the answer is that we spend a lot more time doing something we call a debrief. That is where the teacher, applying some top sight, looking at the feedback trends, says, here's what I see happening, everybody. Here's what I see most of you doing well. Here's what I see most of you struggling with. So we're going to spend more time on that. You spend a lot more time in this debriefing mode because you're seeing the feedback they're giving and receiving. You're seeing what they're using and not using, and you can make interventions at a different level then. This worked really well in content area courses too, like in science writing. Our science colleagues are really good at going, wow, they really get osmosis, but they don't get the Krebs cycle at all. So we're now going to focus on that. Like, right, they didn't have that feedback before because they didn't see in those muddiest point, they didn't see that muddiest point writing. But now they know that the muddiest point isn't this, it's this. So we're going to spend time there.
And I've seen two things work for people who are taking a syllabus they've loved and changed it into something that provides enough practice for students to get better. So notice what I did there, right? You're sacrificing a thing you love to improve student learning. This is hard work. But that is to identify where have I felt like my struggling students have fallen off the rails, right? So it's that deep awareness you have after reading stacks of the same paper and you go, oh, most people didn't know how to do X. Well, that's the thing you practice, right? Which sort of gets at Bill's point about the Krebs cycle. It's just that science has this topography of knowledge in sequence and writing doesn't in the same way, right? But you have that, you just haven't accessed it. So think through that stack of papers. What's the thing you tell everybody 3 times, right? That's the thing you need to practice. And so what's the smallest bit of writing that would let you teach that thing? I love one of Bill's assignments with the literature review, right? So lit reviews are impossible to learn to write unless you have a concept map that takes every citation, every source, and connects it with a verb, right? So-and-so follows so-and-so, so-and-so contradicts so-and-so, so-and-so, elaborates so-and-so. When you know the relationship between the sources, suddenly writing a literature review that's more than and then, and then, and then, is much easier. But a concept map is not necessarily a piece of writing that's going to show up in the literature review itself, right? So it's finding what is the thing people are struggling with and what's the best way to teach just that thing. But everybody I know has struggled with that because they're sacrificing something they love.
Thank you, Louann. Louann writes, thank you, everyone. The discussion's been so thoughtful and helpful. I'm glad, Stephen, that we will have a recording and I can recommend it to others. Thank you for your expertise and ideas, Melissa and Bill, and your organizational prowess, Tim. Well, thank you. And thank you to Dr. Bill Hart-Davidson and Dr. Melissa Meeks for joining us. And thank you from the folks at the Reinvention Collaborative for hosting us for this conversation. It was wonderful to spend some of this beautiful Friday learning with y'all.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.